The phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in April 1993, shattering the quiet of Ruby Marina's small living room in Butler, Alabama. Her hands trembled as she reached for the receiver, the way they always did when the phone rang unexpectedly. 21 years of waiting had taught her that hope and dread were two sides of the same coin. "Mrs. Marina, this is Detective Sarah Pritchard with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation." Ruby's knees buckled. She gripped the edge of her kitchen counter, her other hand clutching the phone so tight her knuckles went white. She'd received calls from law enforcement before, false leads, mistaken identities, dead ends that led nowhere. But something in this woman's voice was different. "We've found her, Mrs. Marina. We found Lollie." The words hung in the air like smoke. Found her. Not alive. Ruby had long ago accepted that terrible truth, but found. After 7,665 days of not knowing, of imagining every horrible possibility, of visiting the sheriff's office every June 19th with the same desperate question, "Have you found my daughter?" 5 months later, on September 15th, 1993, Detective Pritchard stood on the wraparound porch of a sprawling farmhouse just outside Butler, her badge clipped to her belt, an arrest warrant folded in her jacket pocket. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers flanked the steps. The morning sun beat down on the red clay driveway, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. She knocked 3 times. Firm, deliberate, official. When the door opened, Robert Hamilton stood there in pressed khaki pants and a button-down shirt, looking every bit the respectable 73-year-old church deacon the community believed him to be. His face registered confusion, then something darker. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. "Mr. Hamilton, I'm Detective Pritchard. We need you to come with us." Within the hour, the whispers started spreading through Butler's town square like wildfire. Robert Hamilton, led away in handcuffs. The man who'd served as deacon at First Baptist for 15 years. The man whose family had owned land in Choctaw County for generations. The man who'd helped search for Lollie Marina back in 1972. The question that had haunted this tight-knit community for 2 decades finally had an answer. But the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below and let me know. Where are you watching from today? I love hearing from all of you. Lollie Marina wasn't supposed to die at 19. She was supposed to become a teacher. Born on March 3, 1953, in the small town of Butler, Alabama, Lollie grew up in a world where everyone knew everyone, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, and where hard work was the currency that mattered most. Her parents, Ruby and Marcus Marina, raised their 3 children in a modest shotgun house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the screen door never quite closed right and the floorboards creaked with every step. Marcus worked long, back-breaking hours at the Butler Lumber Company, coming home each night with sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands. Ruby took in sewing and alterations, her Singer machine humming late into the evening as she hemmed church dresses and repaired work pants for families around the county. They didn't have much, but what they had was earned honestly, and their children knew it. Lollie was the youngest of 3. Her older brother Joseph, 7 years her senior, had already started working at the mill by the time she was in elementary school. Her sister Margaret, just 4 years older, became her best friend, protector, and the keeper of all her secrets. From the time she could walk, Lollie had a gentleness about her that people noticed. She was the kid who brought home every stray dog, every injured bird, every abandoned kitten she found. She'd nurse them back to health in the garden shed, bottle-feeding them with a patience that seemed beyond her years. Her 3rd-grade teacher once said, "That girl notices when someone's hurting. She's got a gift for caring." At Choctaw County High School, Lollie wasn't the most popular or the prettiest, but she was the one people trusted. If you were having a bad day, Lollie would sit with you at lunch. If you forgot your homework, she'd share hers without making you feel small about it. She dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. She wanted to be the kind of teacher who made kids feel safe, the way Mrs. Henderson had made her feel safe in third grade. But dreams required money, and money was something the Marina family didn't have much of. After graduating high school in May 1971, Lollie faced a harsh reality. College wasn't an option. Not yet, anyway. So she did what countless young women in rural Alabama did. She found work. In early 1971, she took a job as a nanny for the Hamilton family, one of the most prominent families in Choctaw County. The Hamiltons owned a sprawling farm just outside Butler, the kind of property that had been in their family for generations. Robert and Diane Hamilton had 4 young children who needed looking after, and Lollie seemed like the perfect fit. She was responsible, patient, and the kids adored her. The pay wasn't great, $45 a week, but it was steady, and Lollie was determined to save every penny she could. Each morning she'd wake before dawn, help her mama with breakfast, then set out on foot down the red clay road that connected her neighborhood to the Hamilton farm. It was about a 3-mile walk, but Lollie didn't mind. She'd use the time to think, to plan, to dream about the future she was working toward. She confided everything in Margaret. Late at night, the 2 sisters would lie in the bed they shared, whispering in the dark. Lollie talked about saving enough money for community college, maybe even transferring to a 4-year school eventually. She talked about the Hamilton kids and how much she loved working with them. But as the months went on, Margaret noticed something else in her sister's voice. Something uneasy. Lollie never said it outright, but Margaret could tell. Something about Robert Hamilton made her uncomfortable. The way he looked at her sometimes, the way he'd find reasons to be alone with her. Lollie brushed it off, said she was probably imagining things. After all, he was a respected man, a church deacon. Surely she was just being paranoid. She wasn't. June 19th, 1972, started like any other Monday morning in the Marina household. Ruby was already up by 6 a.m., the smell of coffee and bacon filling the small kitchen. Marcus sat at the table reading the previous day's newspaper, still in his undershirt, his work boots by the door waiting for him. Margaret was getting ready for her shift at the diner in town, pinning her hair back in front of the bathroom mirror. Lollie came into the kitchen at 7:15, wearing a simple yellow sundress and white canvas sneakers. She'd tied her dark hair back with a ribbon, and she carried the small cloth bag she always brought to work, packed with a sandwich Ruby had made the night before, an apple, and a thermos of sweet tea. "You eat something before you go," Ruby said, not looking up from the stove. "I'm not that hungry, Mama." "I don't care if you're hungry or not. You got a long walk ahead of you." Lollie smiled and sat down, accepting the plate of scrambled eggs and toast her mother set in front of her. She ate quickly, quietly, while her father turned the pages of his newspaper, and Margaret hummed some song from the radio in the other room. At 7:42, Lollie stood up, kissed her mother on the cheek, and grabbed her bag. "I'll see you tonight," she said. Ruby turned from the sink, drying her hands on her apron. "You be careful on that road. You hear me? And if Mr. Hamilton needs you to stay late, you call me." "I will, Mama. Love you, baby girl." "Love you, too." Those were the last words Ruby Marina ever spoke to her daughter. Lollie walked out the front door at exactly 7:45 a.m. Margaret watched from the window as her little sister headed down the dirt driveway, her yellow dress bright against the red clay and green kudzu that lined the road. She waved. Lollie waved back. Then she turned the corner, and she was gone. The route Lollie took every day was simple and familiar. From the Marina house, she'd walk east on County Road 14, a narrow dirt road that wound through pine trees and past a few scattered houses. About a mile in, she'd pass the Caldwell place, an old white farmhouse where Mrs. Eunice Caldwell usually sat on the porch shelling peas or snapping beans. Mrs. Caldwell saw Lollie that morning, just like she had dozens of times before. She walked past around 8 o'clock, maybe a few minutes after, Eunice would later tell the sheriff. I waved at her and she waved back, smiled real pretty. She looked just fine. Nothing seemed wrong. A quarter mile past the Caldwell house, the road forked. Lollie would take the left fork onto Old Mill Road, which led toward the Hamilton property. It was a lonelier stretch, fewer houses, thicker woods on both sides, and the occasional truck rattling past on its way to the lumber yard. Jimmy Tate, a driver for Butler Lumber, passed Lollie on Old Mill Road that morning around 8:10 a.m. "I recognized her right away," he'd tell investigators. "She was walking on the shoulder, staying out of the way like she always did. I honked and waved. She waved back. That was it. I kept driving." That was the last confirmed sighting of Lollie Marina alive. The Hamilton farm was still another mile and a half down Old Mill Road. Lollie should have arrived by 8:30 at the latest. The children would have been finishing breakfast. Diane Hamilton would have been clearing the table, and Lollie would have taken over, getting the kids dressed, planning activities for the day, keeping the household running smoothly the way she always did. But Lollie never arrived. At first, no one thought much of it. Diane Hamilton assumed Lollie was running late or maybe wasn't feeling well. By 9:30, when there was still no sign of her, Diane called the Marina house. No answer. Ruby and Marcus were both at work by then. Diane managed the kids on her own that day, annoyed but not worried. Young people were unreliable sometimes. Maybe Lollie had decided to quit without notice. It happened. But when 6 p.m. rolled around and Lollie still hadn't come home, Ruby Marina knew something was wrong. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the clock on the wall, her stomach twisting into knots. Marcus had just gotten home from the mill, and Margaret was setting the table for supper. "She should have been home by now," Ruby said, her voice tight. "Maybe the Hamiltons needed her to stay late," Margaret offered, though she didn't believe it herself. "She would have called." Marcus walked to the phone and dialed the Hamilton house. It rang 4 times before Robert Hamilton picked up. "Hamilton residence. Mr. Hamilton, this is Marcus Marina. I'm calling about my daughter, Lollie. Is she still there with you?" There was a pause. "Lollie? No, sir. She never showed up this morning. We thought maybe she was sick or something." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean she never showed up?" "Just what I said. She didn't come to work today. Diane tried calling your house this morning, but no one answered." Marcus's hand gripped the phone. "She left here at 7:45 this morning. She was walking to your place." Another pause. Longer this time. "Well, she never made it here, Mr. Marina. I'm sorry, but I don't know what to tell you." Marcus hung up and looked at Ruby. Her face had gone pale. "Call the sheriff," she whispered. By 8 p.m., the Marina family was in full panic mode. Marcus and Joseph drove the route Lollie would have taken, headlights cutting through the darkness, calling her name out the truck windows. Margaret stayed by the phone, praying it would ring, praying her sister would call and say she'd twisted her ankle or gotten lost or anything other than what they were all starting to fear. Ruby sat at the kitchen table, rosary beads in her hands, whispering prayers through tears she couldn't stop. Sheriff Wade Thornton arrived at the Marina house just after 9 p.m. He took down all the information, what Lollie was wearing, what time she left, where she was headed. He assured them he'd have deputies out searching the roads first thing in the morning. "She probably just got turned around," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "We'll find her." But they didn't. Not that night. Not the next day. The first 48 hours were a blur of terror and desperate hope. Marcus and Joseph searched every inch of County Road 14 and Old Mill Road on foot, looking for any sign, a shoe, her bag, anything. Neighbors joined in. Friends from church organized search parties, combing through the woods and checking abandoned buildings. The sheriff's department interviewed everyone who lived along Lollie's route. Mrs. Caldwell, Jimmy Tate, the Hamiltons. Robert Hamilton repeated the same story. Lollie never showed up that morning. He'd been working on the far side of the property, fixing a fence line. Diane had been home with the kids. Neither of them saw Lollie. Neither of them knew what happened to her. He seemed genuinely concerned, even offered to help with the search efforts. After all, Lollie had worked for his family. He wanted her found just as much as anyone. Or so he said. By the end of the second day, the horrible truth was setting in. Lollie Marina had vanished without a trace. Somewhere between her front door and the Hamilton farm, on a road she'd walked dozens of times before, she had simply disappeared. And no one, except the man who killed her, knew why. Sheriff Wade Thornton had been in law enforcement for 23 years, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the disappearance of Lollie Marina. In a county where the biggest crimes were usually bar fights, petty theft, or the occasional domestic dispute, a missing young woman was unprecedented. Thornton was a decent man, fair, methodical, respected by the community, but he was also a product of his time and place. Missing persons cases, especially in rural Alabama in 1972, didn't come with the resources, technology, or urgency they would in later decades. Still, he tried. God knows he tried. The investigation kicked into high gear on June 20th, the day after Lollie disappeared. Thornton assembled every available deputy, all 4 of them, and began coordinating search efforts with volunteers from the community. They started with the obvious, retracing Lollie's route from her home to the Hamilton farm. Deputies walked every inch of County Road 14 and Old Mill Road, eyes scanning the shoulders, the ditches, the tree line. They were looking for anything. A piece of clothing, her cloth bag, signs of a struggle, tire tracks that didn't belong. They found nothing. Thornton set up a command post at the sheriff's office, a cramped building on Main Street in Butler with peeling paint and a single holding cell. He brought in a large county map and marked it with pins. Red for where Lollie was last seen, blue for areas that had been searched, yellow for places that still needed checking. The interviews began immediately. Ruby and Marcus Marina were first. Thornton sat with them in their living room, notebook in hand, asking questions he already knew the answers to. What was Lollie wearing? Did she have any enemies? Had she mentioned being afraid of anyone? Was there a boyfriend, an ex, someone who might have wanted to hurt her? Ruby answered through tears. No enemies, no boyfriend. Lollie had been too focused on saving money for school. She was a good girl, a sweet girl. She wouldn't have run away. Margaret was interviewed separately. She told Thornton everything she could remember about the last few weeks. Lollie had seemed a little quieter than usual, maybe a little stressed, but Margaret had chalked it up to work. When Thornton pressed her, was there anything specific Lollie had said about the Hamiltons? Margaret hesitated. She said Mr. Hamilton made her uncomfortable sometimes, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But she never said he did anything, just the way he looked at her. Thornton wrote it down, but he didn't give it much weight. Robert Hamilton was a pillar of the community. A man like that didn't just make young women disappear. Eunice Caldwell was interviewed on her front porch, the same porch where she'd waved at Lollie 2 days earlier. She looked perfectly normal, Eunice said, wringing her hands. Smiling, walking like she always did. If something was wrong, I sure couldn't tell. Jimmy Tate, the lumber truck driver, gave a similar account. He'd seen Lollie on Old Mill Road around 8:10 a.m., walking toward the Hamilton place. She'd waved. He'd waved back. Nothing unusual. Did you see any other vehicles on that road? Thornton asked. Jimmy thought for a moment. Maybe 1 or 2 trucks heading toward the mill. Can't say I remember specifics, it was just another Monday morning, you know. Thornton interviewed everyone who lived along the route. A retired couple who lived a quarter-mile past the Caldwell house hadn't seen anything. A young mother with 3 kids said she'd been inside all morning and didn't notice anyone walking by. The more people Thornton talked to, the more frustrated he became. It was as if Lollie had walked into thin air. On June 22nd, Thornton drove out to the Hamilton farm to conduct formal interviews with Robert and Diane Hamilton. The property was impressive. Over 200 acres of farmland, a large 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a barn, several outbuildings, and neatly maintained fences. Robert Hamilton met him at the door, dressed in work clothes, his handshake firm and his demeanor calm. "Terrible business, Sheriff," Robert said, shaking his head. We've been praying for that girl and her family." They sat in the living room, Thornton, Robert, and Diane. The Hamilton children were playing in another room, their laughter drifting through the house. "Walk me through Monday morning," Thornton said, pen poised over his notebook. Diane spoke first. "I got the kids up around 7, made breakfast. Lollie usually arrives by 8:30, so I was expecting her. When she didn't show up by 9, I figured maybe she was running late or not feeling well. I called their house around 9:30, but no one answered." "And you, Mr. Hamilton?" Robert leaned back in his chair, relaxed. "I was out working on the fence line on the south end of the property. Had some posts that needed replacing. I was out there from about 7 in the morning until lunchtime. Never saw Lollie. Didn't even know she hadn't shown up until Diane mentioned it later." "Was anyone with you while you were working?" "No, sir, just me. It's not complicated work. Didn't need help." Thornton made notes. "Did Lollie ever mention any problems? Anyone bothering her? Anything that seemed off?" Both Hamiltons shook their heads. "She was a sweet girl," Diane said. "Good with the kids. Never caused any trouble. I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt her." Robert nodded in agreement. "If there's anything we can do to help, Sheriff, you just let us know. We want her found just as much as anyone." Thornton believed him. Why wouldn't he? Robert Hamilton was a respected landowner, a deacon at First Baptist Church, a family man. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no reason to harm a 19-year-old girl. The interview lasted less than 30 minutes. Thornton thanked them for their time and left, crossing the Hamiltons off his list of potential suspects. It was the biggest mistake of the investigation. As days turned into weeks, the search efforts intensified. Volunteers combed through the dense woods that bordered Old Mill Road, calling Lollie's name, looking for any sign of her. They checked abandoned houses, old hunting cabins, storage sheds, anywhere a person could be hidden or held. The county brought in dogs to track her scent. The dogs picked up her trail along the road but lost it about a mile from the Hamilton farm, near a spot where the woods grew thick and the underbrush was nearly impenetrable. Searchers spent days hacking through that area with machetes, finding nothing but snakes, poison ivy, and mosquitoes. They dragged 2 ponds within a 3-mile radius. Nothing. They stopped every drifter, every stranger passing through town, asking questions, checking alibis. Thornton even looked into a transient worker who'd been seen in the area around that time, a man with a criminal record in Mississippi. But the man had an alibi, confirmed by his employer, and there was no evidence linking him to Lollie. Thornton considered other possibilities. Had Lollie run away? But she'd left everything behind. Her clothes, her savings, her family. That didn't make sense. Had there been a boyfriend no one knew about? Margaret insisted there wasn't, and none of Lollie's friends mentioned anyone. Had she been picked up by someone offering her a ride? Possible, but Lollie was cautious. She wouldn't have gotten into a car with a stranger. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. People had jobs to get back to, families to take care of, lives to live. The initial shock and urgency were fading, replaced by a grim acceptance that Lollie Marina might never be found. The local newspaper ran a few stories in the first couple of weeks. Local girl missing. Search continues for Butler teen. Family pleads for information. But by August, the coverage had stopped. There was nothing new to report. Ruby Marina refused to give up. She called the sheriff's office every other day, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. Thornton always took her calls, always treated her with kindness, but the answer was always the same. "We're still looking, Mrs. Marina. We haven't forgotten about Lollie." But the truth was, the case was going cold. Thornton had interviewed over 50 people, followed up on dozens of tips, and searched hundreds of acres. He had nothing to show for it. The case file, a thin folder containing witness statements, search maps, and a few photographs of Lollie, was placed in a filing cabinet in the back office. It wasn't officially closed, but it wasn't active either. It joined the small stack of unsolved cases that every sheriff's department accumulates over the years, the ones that haunt you but that you don't have the resources or evidence to solve. Thornton would think about Lollie Marina for the rest of his career. He'd wonder what he'd missed, what he could have done differently. But without a body, without evidence, without witnesses, there was nothing more he could do. And it would stay that way for 21 years. 21 years is a long time to live without answers. For Ruby Marina, every single one of those 7,665 days felt like an eternity. She woke up each morning in the same shotgun house where Lollie had grown up, walked past the bedroom her daughter once shared with Margaret, and felt the weight of not knowing pressed down on her chest like a stone. The first year was the worst. Ruby couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the horrible possibilities that played on a loop in her mind. Where was her baby? Was she suffering? Was she alive somewhere, unable to get home? Or had the worst already happened? Marcus tried to be strong for her, but Ruby could see him breaking too. He'd aged 10 years in the span of a few months, his shoulders permanently slumped, his eyes hollow. He stopped going to church, couldn't stand the pitying looks, the whispered prayers, the well-meaning people who had no idea what to say. But Ruby kept going. Every Sunday she sat in that same pew at Shiloh Baptist, hands folded in her lap, praying for a miracle she knew wasn't coming. And every June 19th, without fail, she walked into the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office and asked the same question. Have you found my daughter? The first few years, Sheriff Thornton would sit with her, go over the case file, assure her they hadn't forgotten. But as the years passed and Thornton retired, replaced by a younger sheriff who'd never even met Lollie, the visits became shorter. The answers became vaguer. We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Marina. If anything comes up, you'll be the first to know. We haven't forgotten about Lollie. But Ruby knew the truth. The case was cold. The file was buried. Her daughter had become a statistic, a name in a folder that no one looked at anymore. Still, she kept going. Every single year. Because if she stopped, if she gave up, then Lollie would truly be forgotten. And Ruby couldn't let that happen. Marcus didn't make it to see the 10th anniversary of Lollie's disappearance. He died in March 1981, just 3 months shy of what would have been Lollie's 28th birthday. The official cause was a heart attack, but Ruby knew better. Marcus had died of a broken heart. The not knowing had eaten away at him, year after year, until there was nothing left. Ruby found him in his workshop behind the house, slumped over his workbench, a half-finished birdhouse in front of him. He'd been building it for Lollie, something he did every year on her birthday, even though she wasn't there to receive it. The workshop was full of them, dozens of birdhouses he'd never given away, never thrown out, just kept building as if one day she'd walk through the door and he could finally hand them to her. At the funeral, Margaret held her mother's hand and tried not to fall apart. Joseph stood stone-faced, jaw clenched, anger radiating off him like heat. This is what they did to him, Joseph said later, standing in the cemetery as they lowered Marcus into the ground. The bastard who took Lollie, he killed Daddy too. Just took him 21 years to do it. Ruby didn't argue. He was right. Margaret carried her own burden, one that grew heavier with each passing year. Guilt. She'd been the last person in the family to see Lollie alive. She'd watched her sister walk down that dirt road, waved goodbye, and then gone about her day. She hadn't walked with her, hadn't insisted on driving her, hadn't done anything to protect her, and she'd known. Deep down, Margaret had known something was wrong. Lollie had confided in her about Robert Hamilton, about the way he looked at her, the way he made her uncomfortable. Margaret had told her to quit, to find another job, but Lollie needed the money, and Margaret hadn't pushed harder. I should have made her quit, Margaret told her husband one night, tears streaming down her face. I should have told Mama and Daddy. I should have done something. You couldn't have known, he said, holding her. But Margaret didn't believe that. She replayed that last morning over and over in her mind, wondering what would have happened if she'd just walked Lollie to work that day. Would her sister still be alive? Would their father still be here? The questions never stopped. and neither did the guilt. Joseph's grief manifested differently. Where Ruby clung to hope and Margaret drowned in guilt, Joseph burned with rage. He was angry at the sheriff's department for giving up, angry at the community for moving on, angry at God for letting this happen. But most of all, he was angry at himself for not being able to fix it. Joseph had always been the protector, the big brother who was supposed to keep his sisters safe. But he'd failed, and no amount of searching, no amount of asking questions, no amount of demanding answers from law enforcement had brought Lollie home. Over the years, Joseph became obsessed. He drove the route Lollie had taken dozens of times, stopping at every house, every business, asking if anyone remembered anything. He pestered the sheriff's office so often they started avoiding his calls. He even confronted Robert Hamilton once, showing up at the farm and demanding to know what really happened that day. Hamilton had been calm, almost sympathetic. "I wish I could help you, son, but I don't know anything. I'm sorry for your loss." Joseph wanted to hit him, wanted to grab him by the collar and shake the truth out of him. But he had no proof, no evidence, nothing but a gut feeling that something about Robert Hamilton wasn't right. Eventually, Joseph's marriage fell apart. His wife couldn't handle the obsession, the anger, the way he couldn't let go. She left, taking their 2 kids with her, and Joseph didn't even fight it. What was the point? He'd already lost the person who mattered most. The Marina family, once close-knit and full of life, had been fractured beyond repair. Grief had driven wedges between them, turned them into strangers living separate lives, united only by the ghost of a girl who disappeared on a summer morning in 1972. Choctaw County changed a lot between 1972 and 1993. New businesses opened. Old ones closed. The lumber mill that had employed Marcus Marina for 30 years shut down in 1985, putting half the town out of work. Younger people moved away, looking for opportunities in bigger cities. The population shrank. By the early 1990s, most of the people who remembered Lollie Marina were either dead or elderly. The younger generation, kids who'd been born after she disappeared, had never heard her name. To them, she was just a story their parents might have mentioned once or twice, a cautionary tale about not walking alone, about being careful. Lollie Marina had become a ghost, a footnote in the county's history. But the Hamilton family, they thrived. Robert Hamilton's reputation only grew over the years. He became a deacon at First Baptist Church, a position of honor and respect. He served on the county planning commission, helped organize community events, donated money to local charities. People looked up to him, trusted him, admired him. His children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. Diane Hamilton passed away in 1987 after a battle with cancer, and the community mourned her as a beloved wife and mother. Robert played the role of grieving widower perfectly, accepting casseroles and condolences with grace and humility, and she'd known. Deep down, Margaret had known something was wrong. Lollie had confided in her about Robert Hamilton, about the way he looked at her, the way he made her uncomfortable. Margaret had told her to quit, to find another job, but Lollie needed the money, and Margaret hadn't pushed harder. "I should have made her quit," Margaret told her husband one night, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told Mama and Daddy. I should have done something." "You couldn't have known," he said, holding her. But Margaret didn't believe that. She replayed that last morning over and over in her mind, wondering what would have happened if she'd just walked Lollie to work that day. Would her sister still be alive? Would their father still be here? The questions never stopped, and neither did the guilt. Joseph's grief manifested differently. Where Ruby clung to hope and Margaret drowned in guilt, Joseph burned with rage. He was angry at the sheriff's department for giving up, angry at the community for moving on, angry at God for letting this happen. But most of all, he was angry at himself for not being able to fix it. Joseph had always been the protector, the big brother who was supposed to keep his sisters safe, but he'd failed, and no amount of searching, no amount of asking questions, No amount of demanding answers from law enforcement had brought Lollie home. Over the years, Joseph became obsessed. He drove the route Lollie had taken dozens of times, stopping at every house, every business, asking if anyone remembered anything. He pestered the sheriff's office so often they started avoiding his calls. He even confronted Robert Hamilton once, showing up at the farm and demanding to know what really happened that day. Hamilton had been calm, almost sympathetic. "I wish I could help you, son, but I don't know anything. I'm sorry for your loss." Joseph wanted to hit him, wanted to grab him by the collar and shake the truth out of him, but he had no proof, no evidence, nothing but a gut feeling that something about Robert Hamilton wasn't right. Eventually, Joseph's marriage fell apart. His wife couldn't handle the obsession, the anger, the way he couldn't let go. She left, taking their 2 kids with her, and Joseph didn't even fight it. What was the point? He'd already lost the person who mattered most. The Marina family, once close-knit and full of life, had been fractured beyond repair. Grief had driven wedges between them, turned them into strangers living separate lives, united only by the ghost of a girl who disappeared on a summer morning in 1972. Choctaw County changed a lot between 1972 and 1993. New businesses opened, old ones closed. The lumber mill that had employed Marcus Marina for 30 years shut down in 1985, putting half the town out of work. Younger people moved away, looking for opportunities in bigger cities. The population shrank. By the early 1990s, most of the people who remembered Lollie Marina were either dead or elderly. The younger generation, kids who'd been born after she disappeared, had never heard her name. To them, she was just a story their parents might have mentioned once or twice, a cautionary tale about not walking alone, about being careful. Lollie Marina had become a ghost, a footnote in the county's history. But the Hamilton family? They thrived. Robert Hamilton's reputation only grew over the years. He became a deacon at First Baptist Church, a position of honor and respect. He served on the county planning commission, helped organize community events, donated money to local charities. People looked up to him, trusted him, admired him. His children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. Diane Hamilton passed away in 1987 after a battle with cancer, and the community mourned her as a beloved wife and mother. Robert played the role of grieving widower perfectly, accepting casseroles and condolences with grace and humility. April 1993 started out like any other spring in Choctaw County. The dogwoods were blooming, the air was thick with pollen, and farmers were preparing their fields for planting season. For Robert Hamilton, now 73 years old and living alone on the family farm, it was time to finally deal with the old barn. The structure had been an eyesore for years. Roof sagging, walls leaning at dangerous angles, wood so rotted you could push your finger through it. His son, Robert Jr., had been after him for months to tear it down before it collapsed on its own and hurt someone. "Dad, it's a liability," Robert Jr. had said during Sunday dinner. "What if some kid wanders onto the property and gets hurt? Just hire someone to knock it down and be done with it." So Robert made the call. On April 12, 1993, a 3-man construction crew from Butler arrived at the Hamilton farm with a bulldozer, sledgehammers, and plans to demolish what was left of the barn. The job was supposed to take 2 days, maybe 3 at most. Knock down the walls, haul away the debris, level the foundation, and fill in the floor. Simple work, easy money. The crew foreman was a man named Dale Hutchins, a 42-year-old contractor who'd been doing demolition and construction in Choctaw County for over 20 years. With him were 2 younger guys, Kenny Marsh and Travis Cole, both in their mid-20s, both looking to make some quick cash before the summer heat set in. They started on the exterior, pulling down the walls piece by piece, careful not to let the whole thing come crashing down at once. By the end of the first day, the barn was nothing but a skeleton, a few support beams in the floor. On the morning of April 14th, they began work on the floor itself. The barn had been built with a dirt foundation and wooden floorboards laid over it, the kind of construction common in rural Alabama decades ago. Most of the boards were rotted through, easy to pry up with a crowbar. Dale and his crew worked methodically, pulling up boards, tossing them into a pile to be hauled away. It was Travis who noticed it first. Around 10:30 a.m., he was prying up a section of floorboards near the back corner of the barn when his crowbar hit something that didn't feel like dirt. He stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and leaned down to get a better look. "Hey, Dale," he called out. "There's something weird over here." Dale walked over, Kenny right behind him. Travis pointed to the spot where he'd been working. Beneath the floorboards, the dirt looked different, darker, more compact, like it had been disturbed and then packed down. "Probably just an old root cellar or something," Dale said. "Let's dig it out and see." Travis grabbed a shovel and started carefully removing the dirt. He'd only gone down about 6 inches when the blade of his shovel hit something solid. Not wood, not stone, bone. Travis froze. His hands went numb. For a moment he thought maybe it was an animal, a dog, a deer, something that had crawled under the barn and died years ago. But then he saw the shape, the curve of it, the size. "Dale," he said, his voice shaking. "Dale, you need to see this." Dale knelt down beside him and looked into the shallow hole. His stomach dropped. It was a skull. Human. No doubt about it. "Jesus Christ," Kenny whispered, backing away. Dale stood up, his mind racing. "Nobody touch anything. Travis, go to the truck and radio the sheriff's office now." Travis didn't need to be told twice. He dropped the shovel and ran. Work stopped immediately. The 3 men stood at a distance from the barn, none of them speaking, all of them trying to process what they'd just found. Dale's hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette, his mind running through every possibility. How long had that body been there? Who was it? And did Robert Hamilton know? Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars from the Choctaw County Sheriff's Department came roaring up the dirt driveway, lights flashing. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw was the first one out. He was a big man, mid-50s, with a thick mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. He'd been sheriff for 5 years, having taken over after Wade Thornton retired, and he'd never dealt with anything like this. Dale met him halfway, explained what they'd found. Bradshaw's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "Show me," he said. They walked to the barn, or what was left of it. Bradshaw knelt down beside the excavation site, peering into the hole. He didn't touch anything, didn't disturb the scene, just looked. And then he stood up, pulled out his radio, and made the call. "This is Sheriff Bradshaw. I need the Alabama Bureau of Investigation out here immediately. We've got human remains." The Alabama Bureau of Investigation arrived by early afternoon, bringing with them a forensic team, a medical examiner, and enough equipment to turn the Hamilton farm into a full-scale crime scene. Yellow tape went up around the barn. Photographers documented every angle. A forensic anthropologist was brought in to oversee the excavation, making sure nothing was damaged or lost. The process was painstaking, slow, deliberate. They removed the dirt one careful layer at a time, using brushes and small tools, the way archaeologists might excavate an ancient burial site. And with each layer, more of the remains were revealed. It was a young woman. That much was clear from the skeletal structure. She'd been buried in a shallow grave no more than 2 feet deep directly beneath the barn floor. Her body had been placed on its side, knees drawn up slightly, arms folded across her chest. She'd been there a long time. The bones were discolored, stained by the soil, but they were intact, preserved by the dry conditions under the barn, and she hadn't been alone. The forensic team found something else, smaller bones, fragile and delicate, nestled near the woman's pelvis. Fetal remains. She'd been pregnant when she died. One of the investigators, a woman named Dr. Laura Simmons, knelt beside the grave and felt her chest tighten. Whoever this woman was, she'd been young, and she'd been carrying a child, and someone had killed her and buried her here under a barn floor like she was nothing. They found other evidence too. Fragments of clothing, a yellow fabric that might have been a dress, though it was too deteriorated to be certain. scraps of white canvas that could have been shoes, and near the skull, a small piece of ribbon, faded and rotting but still recognizable. Dr. Simmons carefully bagged each item, labeling them, cataloging them, knowing that every piece could be critical to identifying the victim. By late afternoon, news of the discovery had spread through Butler like wildfire. A body, found on the Hamilton farm, buried under the barn. People gathered in clusters on Main Street outside the diner, in the church parking lot, whispering, speculating, trying to make sense of it. Who was it? How long had it been there? Did Robert Hamilton know? Some folks remembered Lollie Marina. The older generation, the ones who'd been around in 1972, started putting the pieces together. A young woman, buried on the Hamilton property. Could it be? Ruby Marina got the call around 4 p.m. It was Margaret who told her. Margaret had heard the news from a friend who worked at the sheriff's office, and she'd driven straight to her mother's house, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white. She found Ruby in the garden, pulling weeds the way she always did when she needed to keep her hands busy. "Mama," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "they found a body on the Hamilton farm." Ruby looked up, dirt on her hands, her face unreadable. For a moment she didn't say anything. And then quietly, almost like a prayer, she whispered, "Is it her?" "I don't know," Margaret said, "but they're saying it's a young woman, and she's been there a long time." Ruby stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. She didn't cry, didn't collapse. She just nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for 21 years. "It's her," Ruby said. "I know it is." At the Hamilton farm, Robert Hamilton stood on his front porch, watching the swarm of law enforcement vehicles, the investigators in their white suits, the news vans that had started arriving from Montgomery and Birmingham. His face was pale, his hands trembled. When Sheriff Bradshaw approached him to ask questions, Robert's voice was shaky, his words stumbling over each other. "I don't understand," he said. "I had no idea. How could there be a body under my barn? I've lived here my whole life. I don't know anything about this." Bradshaw watched him carefully, noted the sweat on his forehead despite the cool spring air, noted the way his eyes kept darting toward the barn, then away, like he couldn't bear to look. "We're going to need to ask you some questions, Mr. Hamilton," Bradshaw said, "down at the station." Robert nodded, too quickly. "Of course. Whatever you need. I want to help." But even as he said it, Bradshaw could see it. The fear, the guilt, the cracks starting to form in a facade that had held for over 2 decades. By nightfall, the story was everywhere. Local news, regional news. A body found in rural Alabama after more than 20 years. The mystery of Lollie Marina potentially solved. And in a small house on the outskirts of Butler, Ruby Marina sat in her living room, rosary beads in her hands, and waited for confirmation of what her heart already knew. Her daughter was finally coming home. Detective Sarah Pritchard had seen her share of death in 15 years with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, but cold cases hit different. There was something about the weight of time, the families who'd spent years, sometimes decades, without answers, that made these investigations feel personal. When she got the call about the remains found in Choctaw County, she knew immediately this wasn't just another case. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who'd been waiting in the ground for over 20 years to be found. Pritchard arrived at the Hamilton farm on April 15th, the day after the discovery. She was 41 years old, sharp-eyed and methodical, with a reputation for being relentless when it came to solving cases others had given up on. She'd worked homicides in Birmingham, drug trafficking cases along the Gulf Coast, and more cold cases than she could count. But something about this one felt different from the moment she stepped onto that property. She assembled her team quickly. This wasn't going to be a one-person job. Joining her was Detective Marcus Webb, a veteran investigator with 20 years in major crimes, known for his ability to get witnesses to talk. There was also forensic specialist Linda Garrett, who'd worked with the FBI's evidence response team before joining the ABI. And overseeing the forensic anthropology work was Dr. Laura Simmons, one of the best in the state when it came to analyzing skeletal remains. Together, they made the decision that would define the investigation. This was a homicide, and they were going to solve it. The remains were carefully transported to the State Forensic Lab in Montgomery on April 16th. Dr. Simmons and her team began the painstaking process of analysis, determining age, sex, approximate height, time since death, and most critically, cause of death. The findings came back within a week. The victim was a female, approximately 18 to 22 years old at the time of death. She'd been buried for at least 15 to 25 years, based on the condition of the bones and soil analysis. And the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, a single devastating blow to the back of the head that had likely killed her instantly. She'd also been approximately 8 to 10 weeks pregnant when she died. While the forensic team worked in Montgomery, Pritchard and Webb drove to the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office to dig into the archives. They needed to know if there were any missing persons cases from the 1970s or early 1980s that matched the profile. It didn't take long to find Lollie Marina's file. The case had been cold for 21 years, the folder thin and dusty, tucked away in a filing cabinet in the back room. But as Pritchard read through the reports, the witness statements, the search efforts, the interviews with the Hamilton family, she felt the pieces starting to align. Lollie Marina, 19 years old. Disappeared June 19, 1972. Last seen walking toward the Hamilton farm. Never arrived, or so Robert Hamilton had claimed. And now, skeletal remains of a young woman found buried under a barn on that same property. Pritchard looked at Webb. We need dental records. Real quick, if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and share it with someone who loves true crime as much as you do. Cases like this need to be told, and your support helps make that happen. Within 48 hours, dental records confirmed what Ruby Marina had known in her heart. The remains were Lollie's. Now it was time to build a case. Pritchard and Webb began re-interviewing everyone connected to the original investigation who was still alive. Some had moved away, some had died, but enough remained to start piecing together a clearer picture of what had happened in June 1972. Margaret Marina was one of the first people they spoke to. She sat across from Pritchard in a small interview room at the sheriff's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes red from crying. She'd waited 21 years for this moment, and now that it was here, the grief felt as fresh as it had the day Lollie disappeared. Tell me about the weeks before she went missing, Pritchard said gently. Did Lollie say anything to you? Anything that seemed off? Margaret nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me she was pregnant. Pritchard leaned forward. When did she tell you this? About a week before she disappeared. She was terrified. She didn't know what to do. Did she say who the father was? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She didn't want to believe it at first. But it was Robert Hamilton. He'd been inappropriate with her for months. And then one day, it went further. She was scared to say anything because he was her boss, because people respected him. She thought no one would believe her. Pritchard felt her jaw tighten. Did she confront him? She was planning to. She said she was going to tell him she was pregnant and that she needed money to leave town to start over somewhere else. She didn't want to ruin his family, but she couldn't keep working there. She was going to talk to him that Monday morning. The Monday she disappeared. Pritchard and Webb also tracked down Lollie's best friend from high school, a woman named Karen Bledsoe who now lived in Mobile. Karen confirmed what Margaret had said. Lollie had been afraid of Robert Hamilton. She told me he made her uncomfortable, Karen said over the phone. She said he'd corner her when his wife wasn't around, say things that weren't appropriate. She wanted to quit, but she needed the money. I told her to get out of there, but she kept saying she just needed a few more months to save up. The timeline was coming together. Lollie had been pregnant. She'd planned to confront Robert Hamilton, and she'd disappeared the very morning she was supposed to have that conversation. Pritchard pulled up the original interview transcripts from 1972. Robert Hamilton had claimed Lollie never showed up that day. But now, with Margaret's testimony and the location of the body, that story didn't hold up. Lollie had made it to the farm, and Robert Hamilton had been there. The investigators began reconstructing every detail of that day. Who saw what, when, and where. They re-interviewed Eunice Caldwell, now in her 80s, who still remembered waving at Lollie that morning. They spoke to Jimmy Tate, the truck driver, who confirmed he'd seen her walking toward the Hamilton property. And they started building a case against the man who'd buried her under his barn and lived with the secret for 21 years. The call came on April 23, 1993, 9 days after construction workers had uncovered the remains beneath the barn floor. Detective Sarah Pritchard sat in her office at the Alabama Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Montgomery, holding the dental comparison report in her hands. She'd read it 3 times already, but she needed to be absolutely certain before she made the call that would change everything. The match was conclusive. No room for doubt. No margin for error. The skeletal remains found buried on the Hamilton farm belonged to Lollie Marina. Pritchard picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Bradshaw answered on the second ring. "It's her," Pritchard said. "Dental records are a positive match. We need to notify the family." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Bradshaw cleared his throat. "I'll go with you. Ruby Marina deserves to hear this in person." They arrived at Ruby's house just before noon. Margaret was already there. She'd been staying with her mother since the discovery, unable to leave her alone with the weight of waiting. Ruby opened the door before they could knock. She'd seen the official vehicles pull up, had watched through the window as Pritchard and Bradshaw walked up the path. She knew. Somehow she already knew. "It's Lollie, isn't it?" Ruby said, her voice steady despite the tears already forming in her eyes. Pritchard nodded. "Yes, ma'am. The dental records confirm it. I'm so sorry." Ruby's knees buckled, and Margaret caught her, holding her mother as 21 years of hope. Hope she'd clung to even when logic told her it was foolish. Finally shattered. "My baby," Ruby whispered. "My baby girl." They sat in the living room, the same room where Ruby had waited by the phone in 1972, praying for news that never came. Pritchard explained what they'd found, what the forensic analysis had revealed, though she spared Ruby the most graphic details. "We're treating this as a homicide investigation," Pritchard said, "and we're going to find out who did this to your daughter, I promise you that." Ruby looked up, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes suddenly sharp. "It was him, wasn't it? Robert Hamilton." Pritchard chose her words carefully. "We're following every lead, Mrs. Marina. But yes, he's a person of interest." "He killed her," Ruby said, her voice breaking. "He killed my baby and buried her like she was nothing. And he's been walking around free all these years, going to church, living his life, while I've been dying inside." Margaret held her mother tighter, her own tears falling silently. "We're going to get justice for Lollie," Pritchard said. "I give you my word." But Ruby shook her head. "Justice won't bring her back. It won't give me back the 21 years I spent not knowing. It won't let me bury my husband next to his daughter like he deserved." She looked at Pritchard with eyes that had seen too much pain. "But I want him to pay. I want the world to know what he did." Back at the forensic lab in Montgomery, Dr. Laura Simmons was completing her full analysis of the remains. The cause of death was clear: blunt force trauma to the posterior region of the skull. The impact had been severe enough to cause immediate death, a single, powerful blow delivered from behind. The weapon was likely something heavy and flat, a shovel, a board, possibly a piece of farm equipment. Lollie never saw it coming. The fetal remains confirmed what Margaret had already told investigators. Lollie had been approximately 8 to 10 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. DNA testing in 1993 wasn't as advanced as it would become in later years, but the presence of the fetus was documented, photographed, and preserved as evidence. The location of the body told its own story. Lollie had been buried in a shallow grave, hastily dug. directly beneath the barn floor. Whoever killed her had done it quickly without much planning. This wasn't a premeditated murder carried out with precision. This was rage, panic, a desperate attempt to hide what had been done. And the barn was on Robert Hamilton's property. His barn, his land, his crime scene. Pritchard and her team began building their case piece by piece, and with each new detail, Robert Hamilton's 1972 alibi fell apart like wet paper. He'd claimed Lollie never arrived at the farm that morning, but the location of her body proved otherwise. She'd made it there. She'd walked right into the place where she would die. Then came the witness who changed everything. Her name was Vera Hutchins, and in 1972 she'd been a 26-year-old housewife living about half a mile from the Hamilton farm. She'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, but hadn't thought much of what she'd seen that morning, until now. Detective Marcus Webb tracked her down in late April, following up on a list of people who lived near the Hamilton property in 1972. Vera was now 47, living in the same house, and when Webb asked her about June 19, 1972, something clicked in her memory. "I saw her," Vera said, sitting on her porch, a glass of sweet tea in her hand. "I was hanging laundry in the backyard that morning, and I saw a girl in a yellow dress walking up the Hamilton driveway. I remember because I thought it was odd. Usually their nanny came earlier in the morning, but this was closer to 8:30, maybe 8:45. Webb felt his pulse quicken. "You're sure it was the Hamilton driveway?" "Positive. I could see it clear as day from my backyard. She walked right up to the house, and then I went inside to check on my baby. I didn't think anything of it until I heard she'd gone missing. But when the sheriff asked if I'd seen anything unusual, I didn't think a girl walking to work was unusual, you know?" "Did you tell the sheriff you saw her arrive at the farm?" Vera frowned, trying to remember. "I think I mentioned seeing a girl walking, but I don't know if I said where exactly. It was so long ago." Webb thanked her and immediately called Pritchard. "We've got him," he said. "Lollie made it to the farm. Hamilton lied." Pritchard and Webb pulled every piece of evidence they had and laid it out like a puzzle. Robert Hamilton had lied about Lollie never arriving. A witness had seen her walk onto his property. Her body was buried under his barn. She'd been pregnant with what was almost certainly his child, and Margaret's testimony confirmed that Lollie had planned to confront him that very morning. They dug deeper into Hamilton's background, interviewing people who'd known him over the years, looking for patterns. What they found was disturbing. A woman who'd worked as a housekeeper for the Hamiltons in the late 1960s said Robert had made inappropriate comments to her, had cornered her in the laundry room once, and tried to kiss her. She'd quit without explanation. A teenage girl who'd babysat for the family in 1975 said Robert had always made her uncomfortable, the way he'd stand too close, the way he'd find excuses to be alone with her. Another former employee mentioned that Robert had a temper, that he was controlling and didn't like being questioned or challenged, especially by women. The pattern was clear. Robert Hamilton was a predator. He used his position, his power, his reputation to manipulate and control young women. And when Lollie Marina, pregnant and desperate, confronted him, threatened to expose him, he'd killed her. The pieces were falling into place. The timeline made sense. The evidence was mounting. And Robert Hamilton's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. On May 3, 1993, Detective Pritchard walked into Sheriff Bradshaw's office and laid the case file on his desk. "We have probable cause," she said. "It's time to bring him in." Bradshaw looked at the file, then at Pritchard. He nodded slowly. "Let's get a warrant." Robert James Hamilton was 73 years old in the spring of 1993, and to anyone who knew him, he was the picture of Southern respectability. He still lived on the family farm that had been in the Hamilton name for 4 generations, though he'd slowed down considerably in recent years. His hair had gone completely white, his hands shook slightly when he held his coffee cup, and he walked with a cane after a hip replacement surgery 2 years earlier. He attended First Baptist Church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew he'd occupied for decades, nodding along to the sermon, shaking hands during fellowship hour. People respected Robert Hamilton. They always had. He'd built a successful life after Lollie Marina disappeared. Or rather, after he'd murdered her and buried her under his barn. He'd expanded his farming operation in the 1970s, invested in timberland in the 1980s, served on the county planning commission, donated generously to local charities and church-building funds. When his wife Diane died of cancer in 1987, the whole community had mourned with him. Casseroles appeared on his doorstep for weeks. People told him what a good husband he'd been, what a pillar of strength. No one suspected that beneath the kind smile and the firm handshake lived a man who'd taken a young woman's life to protect his own reputation. But Detective Sarah Pritchard saw through it. She'd spent weeks studying Robert Hamilton. Not the public persona, but the man underneath. And what she found was a textbook narcissist, a predator who'd spent his entire life manipulating people and situations to maintain control. Robert Hamilton wasn't a man who'd made one terrible mistake in a moment of passion. He was a man who believed he was entitled to whatever he wanted, and when someone threatened that sense of entitlement, he eliminated the threat. Lollie Marina had been that threat. She'd been 19 years old, vulnerable, and dependent on him for her income. He'd been 52, married with 4 children, a respected landowner and church member. The power imbalance was staggering, and Robert had exploited it. According to Margaret's testimony and statements from Lollie's friends, Robert had been inappropriate with Lollie for months before her death. Lingering looks, comments about her appearance, finding excuses to be alone with her when Diane wasn't around. And then, sometime in early spring of 1972, it had escalated. Lollie had been too ashamed to give Margaret all the details, but the implication was clear. Robert Hamilton had sexually assaulted her, and she'd gotten pregnant as a result. For Robert, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. If word got out that he'd gotten his teenage nanny pregnant, his reputation would be destroyed. His marriage would end. His standing in the church would evaporate. He might even face criminal charges. So when Lollie walked onto his property on the morning of June 19th, 1972, planning to confront him, planning to ask for money so she could leave town and start over, Robert saw only one solution. He killed her. The psychological profile that Pritchard and her team developed painted a disturbing picture. Robert Hamilton was a man who needed to be in control at all times. He needed to be seen as respectable, moral, upstanding. His identity was built on his reputation, and he would do anything, including murder, to protect it. He was also arrogant. Dangerously so. Most killers try to distance themselves from their victims, to hide the body somewhere far away, somewhere it won't be connected to them. But Robert had buried Lollie on his own property, under his own barn, and then lived there for 21 years. He'd walked past that barn hundreds of times, knowing what was underneath. He'd even had people working on the property over the years, farm hands, contractors, family members, and never worried that someone might discover his secret. That kind of arrogance came from a deep-seated belief that he was untouchable, that he was smarter than everyone else, that he would never be caught. And for 21 years, he'd been right. When news broke that Robert Hamilton was a suspect in Lollie Marina's murder, the community of Choctaw County fractured. Some people refused to believe it. Robert Hamilton, the man who'd served as a deacon for 15 years, the man who'd donated money to rebuild the church roof after the storm in 1985, the man who'd helped organize the annual Christmas toy drive. Impossible. There had to be some mistake. "I've known Robert my whole life," said one church member in an interview with the local paper. "He's a good man, a godly man. I don't care what the police say, he didn't do this." But others weren't so sure. Whispers started circulating, stories that had been buried for years suddenly resurfacing. A woman came forward and said Robert had made a pass at her at a church social in 1979. She'd been 23, newly married, and when she'd rebuffed him, he'd acted like nothing had happened. She'd never told anyone because who would believe her over Robert Hamilton? Another woman, now in her 60s, said Robert had employed her as a housekeeper in the late 1960s and had repeatedly made her uncomfortable with inappropriate comments and unwanted touching. She'd quit after 3 months and never went back. A man who'd worked on the Hamilton farm as a teenager in the 1970s said Robert had a temper, that he'd seen him fly into a rage over small things, a gate left open, a tool not put back in the right place. He had to have everything his way, the man said. And if you crossed him, you knew it. The pattern was undeniable. Robert Hamilton had spent decades preying on young women, using his power and position to get what he wanted, and silencing anyone who might expose him. Robert's 4 children, now adults with families of their own, were blindsided. Robert Jr., the oldest, released a brief statement through his lawyer. Our family is cooperating fully with the investigation. We are as shocked and devastated by these allegations as anyone. But privately, the Hamilton children were grappling with a horrifying reality. Their father might be a murderer. The man who'd taught them to ride bikes, who'd taken them fishing, who'd walked his daughters down the aisle at their weddings. That man had killed a 19-year-old girl and buried her under a barn. One of Robert's daughters, Catherine, would later tell investigators that she'd always sensed something dark in her father, something she couldn't quite name. He was charming in public, she said, but at home he was different, controlling, cold. My mother walked on eggshells around him. Another daughter admitted that she'd found her father's behavior toward young women uncomfortable over the years, but had convinced herself she was imagining things. You don't want to believe your own father is capable of something like that, she said, tears streaming down her face. But now I look back, and I see it. I see what he was. The question everyone kept asking was, why did he kill her? The answer, Pritchard believed, was simple. Robert Hamilton killed Lollie Marina because she threatened everything he'd built. His reputation, his marriage, his standing in the community, his sense of control. When Lollie confronted him that morning, told him she was pregnant, demanded money or help or accountability, Robert saw his entire life crumbling. And rather than face the consequences of his actions, rather than admit what he'd done and accept responsibility, he chose violence. He killed her in a rage, a single blow to the back of the head with a shovel or some other heavy object. And then, in the cold calculation that followed, he buried her under the barn floor, told everyone she'd never shown up for work, and went on with his life as if nothing had happened. For 21 years, he'd carried that secret. For 21 years, he'd looked Ruby Marina in the eye at church, at the grocery store, around town, knowing exactly what had happened to her daughter. That took a special kind of evil, a special kind of arrogance. And now, finally, Robert Hamilton was going to answer for it. The interrogation room at the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office was small and windowless, with cinder block walls painted an institutional beige and a metal table bolted to the floor. On one side sat Detective Sarah Pritchard and Detective Marcus Webb. On the other sat Robert Hamilton and his attorney, a sharp-dressed lawyer from Montgomery named Gerald Whitmore, who'd been hired by the Hamilton family the moment the arrest warrant was issued. It was September 15, 1993, 5 months after construction workers had uncovered Lollie Marina's remains, and 4 months after the investigation had turned its full focus on Robert Hamilton. The arrest had happened that morning. Pritchard and a team of deputies had shown up at the Hamilton farm at dawn with a warrant. Robert had answered the door in his bathrobe, his face pale, his hands shaking. He hadn't resisted, hadn't said a word. Just let them cuff him and lead him to the patrol car while neighbors watched from their windows. Now he sat across from Pritchard, his lawyer whispering in his ear, telling him not to say anything, to let them handle this. But Pritchard could see it in Robert's eyes. The arrogance, the need to be in control, the belief that he could still talk his way out of this. She'd seen it before in men like him, men who'd spent their whole lives manipulating people, who believed they were smarter than everyone else, who couldn't resist the urge to explain themselves, to justify what they'd done. Pritchard started slow, methodical. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, like cards on a table. We have dental records confirming the remains are Lollie Marina's. Robert stared at the table. We have forensic evidence showing she died from blunt force trauma to the skull. His jaw tightened. We have a witness who saw Lollie walk onto your property the morning of June 19, 1972, the same morning you claimed she never showed up. His lawyer leaned over. Don't say anything, Robert. But Pritchard kept going. We have testimony from Lollie's sister that she was pregnant, that she was planning to confront you that morning, that you were the father. Robert's hands clenched into fists on the table. We know she made it to your farm, Mr. Hamilton. We know you lied, and we know you killed her. Robert, don't, his lawyer started, but Robert cut him off. She was going to ruin me, Robert said, his voice low and bitter. The room went silent. Whitmore closed his eyes, knowing his client had just made a catastrophic mistake. Pritchard leaned forward slightly. Tell me what happened. And Robert Hamilton, unable to stop himself, did. She showed up that morning, just like she always did. But this time she was different, angry. She said she was pregnant, said it was mine, said she was going to tell Diane, tell the church, tell the sheriff if I didn't give her money to leave town. His voice was rising now, defensive, indignant. I told her she was being ridiculous, that no one would believe her. But she wouldn't listen. She kept threatening me, saying she'd ruin my life, my family, everything I'd worked for. So what did you do? Pritchard asked calmly. I told her to meet me in the barn, said I'd give her the money, that we'd figure something out. But when we got in there, she just kept going on and on about how I'd taken advantage of her, how I was a hypocrite, how everyone needed to know what kind of man I really was. Robert's face twisted with anger, the same rage he must have felt that morning 21 years ago. I couldn't let her destroy me. I'd worked too hard, built too much, so I grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall, and I hit her, just once. She went down and didn't get up. The confession spilled out of him like poison, and Pritchard let the tape recorder capture every word. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I dug a hole right there, under the floorboards, and I buried her, covered it back up, put the boards back down. No one ever knew. 21 years, Webb said quietly. You lived with that for 21 years. Robert looked up, and for a moment, Pritchard thought she might see remorse, guilt, some flicker of humanity, but there was nothing. She put me in that position, Robert said coldly. She came to my property, threatened my family, tried to destroy everything I'd built. What was I supposed to do? Even now, sitting in an interrogation room with a murder confession on tape, Robert Hamilton couldn't accept responsibility. He blamed Lollie, the 19-year-old girl he'd assaulted, impregnated, and killed. In his mind, she was the problem, not him. Pritchard stood up, her face expressionless. Robert James Hamilton, you're under arrest for the first-degree murder of Lollie Marina. You have the right to remain silent, though I see you've already waived that. Robert's lawyer put his head in his hands. The confession was on tape, witnessed, recorded, undeniable. Robert Hamilton had just sealed his own fate. The trial of Robert James Hamilton began on March 7, 1994, in the Choctaw County Courthouse, a stately brick building on Main Street in Butler that had stood since 1907. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled. People lined the walls, craned their necks to see. News crews from Montgomery, Birmingham, and even Atlanta had set up outside, their satellite trucks crowding the courthouse square. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was the resolution of a 22-year-old mystery, a reckoning for a man who'd hidden behind respectability while a family suffered. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Thornton, no relation to the original sheriff, presented a case so airtight it was almost impossible to refute. They had the confession, Robert Hamilton's own words recorded on tape, admitting he'd killed Lollie Marina with a shovel and buried her under his barn. They had forensic evidence. Dr. Laura Simmons testified about the blunt force trauma to Lollie's skull, the fetal remains proving she'd been pregnant, the location of the body on Hamilton's property. They had witness testimony. Margaret Marina took the stand and told the jury about Lollie's fear, her pregnancy, her plan to confront Robert Hamilton. Vera Hutchins testified that she'd seen Lollie walk onto the Hamilton property that morning, destroying Robert's claim that she'd never arrived. The defense, led by Gerald Whitmore, had almost nothing to work with. They argued that Robert was an old man now, 74 years old, in poor health, no threat to anyone. They pointed out the passage of time, suggested that memories could be unreliable, that the confession had been made under duress, though the tape clearly showed otherwise. But there was no escaping the evidence, no explaining away the body buried under his barn, no justifying the lies he'd told for over 2 decades. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict that everyone had been waiting for. We find the defendant, Robert James Hamilton, guilty of first-degree murder. Ruby Marina, sitting in the front row with Margaret beside her, closed her eyes and let the tears fall. 22 years. 22 years of not knowing, of waiting, of praying for this moment. And now it was here. The judge sentenced Robert Hamilton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 74, it was effectively a death sentence. Before sentencing was finalized, Margaret Marina stood to deliver her victim impact statement. Her voice shook, but she didn't break. "Lollie was my sister, my best friend, my protector," Margaret said, looking directly at Robert Hamilton. "You took her from us. You took her life, her future, her dreams. You took my father's will to live. You took 22 years of my mother's life, years she spent in agony, not knowing what happened to her baby girl." She paused, wiping her eyes. "But you didn't win. Because we never stopped looking. We never stopped believing. And now the whole world knows what you are. Not a respected man, not a church deacon, a murderer. And that's how you'll be remembered." Robert Hamilton showed no emotion. He stared straight ahead, his face blank, as if none of this had anything to do with him. The Hamilton family, his children, his grandchildren, sat in the back of the courtroom, heads down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Their father's crimes had shattered their lives, left them isolated and ashamed. Some of them would eventually leave Choctaw County, unable to bear the weight of the Hamilton name. The case had a ripple effect far beyond Butler, Alabama. It became a landmark for cold case investigations across the state, proof that time doesn't erase guilt, that evidence preserved and families who refuse to give up can still bring justice decades later. Robert Hamilton died in prison on November 12, 1998, at the age of 78. He never expressed remorse, never apologized to the Marina family. He took his arrogance to the grave. But Lollie Marina's legacy lived on. In 1995, Ruby Marina established the Lollie Marina Memorial Scholarship Fund, awarded annually to a young woman from Choctaw County pursuing higher education, the dream Lollie never got to fulfill. A small memorial was placed in Butler's town square, a simple stone marker with Lollie's name, her dates, and the words, "Gone but never forgotten." Ruby Marina lived to see justice for her daughter, and that gave her a measure of peace she'd never thought possible. She passed away quietly in her sleep on June 19, 2001, exactly 29 years to the day after Lollie disappeared. Those who knew her said she'd finally been able to let go, knowing her daughter's story had been told and her killer had been held accountable. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Lollie's matter, and your support helps make sure they're never forgotten. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Time may pass, but truth endures. Lollie Marina's story reminds us that every victim deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and some secrets can't stay buried forever. Her life was stolen. Her dreams were cut short. But her memory lives on, in the scholarship that bears her name, in the memorial that stands in her hometown, and in the hearts of everyone who refused to let her be forgotten. Rest in peace, Lollie Marina. Your story has been told, and justice, at long last, was served.